Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We'll just give everybody a couple minutes to get settled, get used to their sound, and we'll get started in just a moment. Thank you all for joining us for a special virtual conversation of crime on the Bayou. We'll get started in just a minute. I'll let a couple more people join, and I'll keep filling the air so people don't have to enter a quiet room, right? That's awkward. We hope you all enjoyed the film and are having a good summer. It's been a couple of weeks, just a couple of weeks since we've had one of these. We just finished our Israel Film Center Festival, and I'll share some upcoming events in just a moment as everybody joins and gets connected to the sound here. I think we can get started, jump right in. Let me just tell you about some upcoming events. First of all, you're here again for the special conversation for A Crime on the Bayou. And coming up next week, a week from today, is our rooftop screening of Spaceballs. If you've seen it, you want to be there. If you haven't seen it, you want to be there. This is going to be a lot of fun. We're happy to do these fun outdoor screenings in a very safe way. So please join us and tell your friends about a special screening of Spaceballs on the rooftop of the JCC. The following week, we decided we wanted to do, and I'm giving credit here to our program manager, Morgan, about this. We wanted to do one of the films that we screened virtually this year. Which one would we want to screen in person on our rooftop? Which one fit for that? And Adelengi and the Cakes of Versailles was a film that got excellent reviews when we screened it virtually, and is really, I think, one of the finer documentaries to come out this year. And we're excited to screen it in person the following week, July 27th on the JCC rooftop. We're about to announce all of our August films, but I'll tell you that there's a film from Sundance called Misha and the Wolves. We have some films from Tribeca, other films from Sundance coming out both virtually and in person on our rooftop. And in the fall, our auditorium will be up and running, and we will be back to in-person screenings, and we hope everyone can join us for that. So please share with your friends and join us for as many screenings as they continue. And yeah, let's jump into tonight's event. How many of you, by a show of hands, and yes, feel free to keep your cameras on, how many of you have seen already Crime on the Bayou? I don't think that we can really spoil it too much, but this is going to be a very open conversation. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll be happy to contact you and open your mic so you could ask those questions live. We are really excited to have here tonight the director of the film, Nancy Buirski. Nancy, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And I'll start off with a quick Q&A and then hand things over to you guys for some questions. Nancy, you've been involved with a lot of my favorite documentaries that have been made in recent years. And I was a big fan of The Loving Story, Afternoon of a Fawn, and now I'm really excited to discuss with you A Crime on the Bayou. Starting from there, really, how did this project start for you? Why did you want to make a film about this topic?
You know, I had made two other films that were related. One was called The Loving Story, as you mentioned, and then I also made a film a few years ago called The Rape of Recy Taylor. And they were both, they both dealt with institutional racism, they dealt with white supremacy, they dealt with the law, and most importantly, they dealt with the individuals who had not set out they weren't activists, they hadn't set out to change history, but by standing up for their rights and their principles, they actually did change history. So these are, all three films highlight unsung heroes. They highlight reluctant heroes. And I found myself really attracted to that kind of character. They're very noble in my mind. They're not, again, they're not trying to draw attention to themselves. They're only doing what they feel is right. And Gary Duncan, who is the subject of A Crime on the Bayou, a 19-year-old Black fisherman who stands up to a white supremacist government in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, is a perfect example of this kind of hero. So even though I hadn't set out to make a trilogy, ultimately that's what this became. And I felt like I was threading these themes together by looking at different situations, but by highlighting these themes. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying that's how I came to this story. I was also inspired by a book that was being written on the subject called Deep Delta Justice by Matthew Van Meter.
So I was going to mention later on in my questions, like Gary Duncan seems like just such a gift for documentary filmmakers and for anyone who gets to hear his story and share his story. He seems very approachable and open and honest. Can you tell us a little bit about working with him and interviewing him and the process with him?
He's one of the best souls I've ever worked with. And I have such admiration for him. I can't even begin to express how much I care about Gary as an individual and as an inspiration for this kind of change in society. And, Gary still feels this way. Gary is now in his 70s and he still stands up for what is right and is against what is wrong. And he's very outspoken, but in a very gentle way. And he's an example of what you can achieve nonviolently, with a certain kind of with a real decency and gentleness, and you kind of love him. And it was just great working with him.
I mean, I have to share that, I cried a couple of times because of Gary throughout watching this film, and
he's the heart of the story.
He seems like a really special person. And Richard Sobel, it looked like you interviewed him at multiple points in his life.
I didn't interview him in 2011. That there is an interview that we obtained from the Library of Congress that was made in 2011. That wasn't my interview. The interview that I did was in 2019, going into 2020. And he was ailing at that point. And so because he couldn't flesh out a lot of the answers that we needed in the film, we ended up going to that 2011 interview as well and kind of fusing them together. He was also a wonderful person to work with, someone I admire greatly, someone who did not want a lot of attention drawn to him. In fact, he wasn't eager to be interviewed for the film. But then when he realized it was an opportunity for us to lift up Gary's story and draw attention to Gary's nobility, he agreed.
And really, I mean, not to give away too much for those who haven't seen the film yet, but it's really good that he was such a part, and to have also those different perspectives of him telling his story, I think cover it all. So before I dive in, I'm going to dive in a little deeper, but I also wanted to ask you about two more things: the music in the film and the editing of the film, which I think both of those are related to me, and I think were unique. Could you tell us a little bit about musical choices and editing choices as far as how you approached it?
Okay, well, the editing, the music is important to me in all my films. I find that sometimes you can overdo the music, particularly if the music is manipulating and trying to signal to you how you should feel. I hope I don't do that, but I do feel that music is a character in the film. And I looked for music that was a little unexpected. People would usually expect a kind of bluesy score or something that was indigenous to New Orleans. And instead we used a kind of cool jazz score, which reminded us of what was so unexpected about this story. I mean, this story is, I can't help but thinking that it's almost cynical, that this is a man that gets arrested for touching a white boy's arm. it's kind of, it reaches a level of absurdity. And there was something about this, the kind of cool jazz that highlighted that for us. So those were most of my choices, but I do work with a wonderful music supervisor named Doug Burnham. And he's very helpful in helping us, fine tune a lot of those choices. We were blessed to be able to use a film by a song by Bob Dylan. His office made that available to us. And then there's some other interesting choices, Louisiana 1927, Randy Newman. There's also the Virgil Thompson score that goes along with the original Louisiana story made by Robert Flaherty. And that's a little bit lusher. That has a full orchestration, and it's a little bit kind of lusher score, but that worked well with the water themes that go into the film. That it just kind of spoke to us in terms of those themes. So, we look for music that really speaks to the themes of the film. The editing, I work with Anthony Rapoli very, very closely. And that to me is the most fun part of telling these stories. I don't write the stories down on a piece of paper. I mean, I don't write the story on a piece of paper. It all happens kind of in my head with Anthony. That's the way the story unfolds. And coming up with the structure of it is, part of the challenge of making the film. But he's a wonderful, wonderful editor. And he and I, at this stage, we've worked together on 2 other films, and we kind of finish each other's sentences.
Amazing. Great job. And I have to nerd out for a moment. And the Randy Newman song, of course, I've heard a few recordings of it, and it's really the most representative of kind of the atmosphere of Louisiana, and took us right there. So
the Randy Newman song really talks about the flood of 1927, and we do have this this sense of people being affected by hurricanes and floods in Louisiana, and how unpredictable that can be, and how it can just uproot them and destroy their lives. That's not that different from the autocratic governments that they're living under. That unpredictability, you never know when you're going to cross the line, anything can happen. So there's a kind of vulnerability that exists in their lives. And the extreme water events that take place in Louisiana, I felt reflected that vulnerability of our subjects. So that Randy Newman song really fits beautifully into that.
Yep, I completely agree. So let me dive in deeper just into what I think is like a really important topic. But why was it important for you to tell this story now at this point in time?
We're in a climate where we're very sensitive and fortunately very aware. I shouldn't say fortunately that it's happening, but fortunately that we are more aware of the numerous attacks on Black men in society, how abusive it is, and how vulnerable Black men are to officials, corrupt forces, police. And here's a man who gets arrested for touching a white boy's arm. I felt like there could be no better representation of how cruel and unfair the system is to Black men in particular, and Black people in general.
So I found one of the most impactful moments of the film is really when I think it was Richard Sobel who was talking about what things were like in his era as far as the importance in his community of civil rights. And I'm representing here the Jewish Community Center and in Manhattan, which is a pretty progressive community. And I question where the Jewish community is today in comparison to what was going on in the 1960s.
It's a good question. I think one thing that we should remember is that the Jewish community today is also a victim of anti-Semitism, much as it was in the 60s. And, I think that white people in general are feeling the harm of both racism and anti-Semitism today. And many are very, very active. I mean, there were a lot of white people, and I dare say Jewish people, out in the streets protesting after George Floyd's murder. So do we have the numbers? No, I don't know how many people were, physically there, but I suspect that there is as much sensitivity to these atrocities today as there was back in the 60s, when it was a little bit more noticeable, when the Jewish lawyers traveled to the South to work on civil rights cases. We were a little bit more aware of it because they were doing something very specific where they were needed. They were desperately needed in the courts because judges were treating Black lawyers very badly. So, that's part of the story we're telling. And I think today it may not be as specifically connected to individual cases, but I think we're probably seeing vast numbers of Jews participating in the struggle.
I hope so. That's good to hear. I think for a long time the Jewish community is possibly riding on kind of the real impact that the 1960s had and the civil rights movement, and I think we can't just look to our past. We need to really look to our future and take a really big statement and a big stand here today and unite the Jewish community around that.
I think the reason that movies that are based in history, this one is in the 60s, the reason I like telling those stories is that they become cautionary tales. And so I think that's kind of what you're saying, that we need to be careful. We can't take things for granted. And so Jews and whites in general really need to step up where they're welcome to try to make a difference. And as Angela Davis says in our movie, she feels that it's very important that people who are not the obvious targets of these crimes are still targets, because, if one person in society is harmed, we're all harmed. And that's kind of one of the messages that I hope comes through in the film.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. I think it is an important message to bring to our audience, and definitely use the film as a way. And that's how I saw it too. I was like, we were a big part of this, and we can't forget that, and we need to live up to the level of this legacy. I wanted to also talk about specifically about the case in the film and what was so significant about it. What made this such a case that really stood out?
When you think about it, we take trial by jury for granted today. That most of us, beyond a small misdemeanor, almost anybody who is arrested for a serious crime can have a trial by jury if he or she chooses to. In that day, that wasn't the case. Louisiana had its own state regulations, as many of the states did. I mean, a lot of the things that were overturned in the 60s were changed from states determining what would happen as compared to the federal government determining what would happen. So the Louisiana state rules about juries, that was kind of based on the Napoleonic Code, believe it or not. Most of our country, our codes, it comes from the Magna Carta. But in Louisiana, which is so French-based, that emerged out of the Napoleonic Code. And Gary Duncan was not allowed a trial by jury. Now, ironically, in '66, a trial by jury might not have been any fairer to Gary Duncan as the individual judge that ruled in his case. But that judge was appointed by Leonard Perez, who is the so-called villain in our story. He's the white supremacist who is ruling Plaquemines Parish. So that's all to say that a judge who is appointed by someone like a white supremacist should not be the person who weighs in on a case like Gary Duncan's. And Richard Sobel very smartly used that to wage an appeal after Gary Duncan was found guilty. I'm not sure I'm answering your question directly, but I just wanted to give it some context. It's really important to recognize that that was a state determination, and that's what the Supreme Court ruled against. And Gary Duncan won his hearing at, that ruling in the Supreme Court. It was Duncan versus Louisiana.
Fascinating. and really I think the film gets into some of the legal elements of the time in a very interesting way. And I know someone who didn't grow up in that.
Better than I just did. It's not always easy to explain.
I have to ask you, Leonard Perez, who is an amazing villain, right? Like, out of the books. I've seen other films that have covered characters like him. Can you place him anywhere else? Like, where has his story come up before?
I don't know. I mean, for a while I was living in North Carolina, and people in North Carolina knew of him. I think many people in the South knew Leonard Perez, but most people in the North didn't know very much about him. So he was kind of a revelation to a lot of people who saw our film, and he could not have been more outspoken.
Yeah, really, what a character.
Yeah. I see, but a seriously dangerous character too.
Oh, no question.
I mean, he seems comical in a way, but boy, he made a lot of people's lives very miserable.
No comedy there, and I'm sorry if I even bring any lightness to it. I mean, he was a real person.
Well, he's absurd, so it's hard not to kind of shake your head when you're hearing what he has to say. But he had a lot of power.
It sounds like it, and it sounds like he really controlled the area.
He did.
Did terrible things and was as big of a racist as they get.
That's right.
I'm going to ask the question that that I often ask in these interviews, but I actually feel that this film, I'm anxious to hear your answer. What surprised you? What didn't you know while you were when you came into making the film that you discovered in the process?
The entire story. The entire story. I knew nothing about Gary Duncan. I knew nothing about Leonard Perez. I knew nothing about the system of government in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana. And I was appalled to know how many people were against integrating the schools in 1966, 12 years after Brown v. Board. It was pretty horrifying, actually. I was very moved by the brave people that acted against this, Gary Duncan, Richard Sobel, other lawyers like Armin Dürfner, who plays an important role in our film, and actually the Black lawyers who made up that Collins, Douglas, and Eli firm. They're pretty important people too, and I was really glad to find out more about them.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question or two. I have a few more questions, but I want to give people from the audience an opportunity to ask questions. If you have any, please place them in the chat and we'll bring you on live, or raise your hand if you have any questions. Let me ask you a little bit, I'll call it the third act of the movie. The last part of the film really focuses on the cases against the lawyers, which was really interesting from a legal perspective. And I would just love to know, like, how that fit in for you, like how that fit into the story, because it's really its own story kind of on its own.
In many ways, it's a more important story than the Duncan versus Louisiana. I mean, the fact that jury trials are mandated by the government now is important. I don't want to diminish the importance of that. But the idea that we begin to see how bizarre the legal systems are that were being practiced in the South, as Armin Dürfner says, he calls it pretend law, that they were getting away with that. The reason that Richard Sobel is actually arrested for practicing law without a license. This is the kind of power that people like Leonard Perez had. And he wasn't alone. In many Southern states, those bosses, those racist bosses, wielded a tremendous amount of power. And they had the legal system to back them up. That's what's so important about this. People talk about white supremacy all the time. And we think about white supremacy as an ideology, people waving banners, yelling, shouting, all of that. We don't stop to think about how it actually works. And I think what our film tries to do is show you the mechanics of white supremacy, that it actually works in the court system. And so these lawyers who came to defend these civil rights cases were fighting against that pretend law of the Southern system. And that's why they weren't wanted there. That's why Richard Sobel is arrested for practicing law without a license, which people do all over the country. As long as you associate yourself with another law firm, you can go to another state. But he didn't want to have anything to do with it. He wanted those white lawyers out of there because it was shining a light on how crooked their legal system was.
So I'm going to ask one last question. What can people do today? When people see the film, what do you hope they'll come out and do?
I hope everyone will step up and try to make a difference, even if they think they can't. One of the things that we understand when we look at that film and The Loving Story and The Rape of Recy Taylor, all the three very brave people who stand up for their rights, is that anybody can change history. You do not have to be a lawyer. You do not have to be an activist. You stand up for yourself and you stand up for principle, and maybe you too will change history. And maybe you won't individually, but as a group, perhaps you will. So I think that's an important takeaway for me. And by the way, everybody else who worked with me on this film, I just want to give a shout out to, I think, one of my producers who's here, Susan Martelin, who is, critical to the success of this film, and others like Claire Chandler and Vanessa Martino, and as I said, Anthony Rapoli, our editor, Rex Miller, our cinematographer. I really want to emphasize the fact that we don't make these films alone, that, just as I'm suggesting people join groups to make a difference, we have a wonderful family of people who work on these films, and I'm really proud to work with them.
Thank you so much. The film really, I think, is so important. Folks, tell your friends. It has 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, and I think a lot of people should be seeing this film and being impacted by it. Nancy, thank you for being here with us. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at other screenings and other events.
Are there any questions in the chat room that you wanted to?
There have not been any questions in the chat room. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me.
They know it all, or I covered it.
Well, and they can also contact us on A Crime in the Bayou, our Facebook page. We have Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And please, join up and follow us. And if they have any questions or want to discuss this further, we'd be happy to do that.
Thank you. We'll put that link, Crime on the Bayou. What is the link again?
A Crime on the Bayou.
Crime on the Bayou. Thank you, folks. Thank you, Nancy.
You're welcome.
Have a good night.
Thank everybody for coming.